Hey guys, what's up? Today I'll be doing a video counting down 13 stone cold classics in the genre of brutal death metal. This was a video tag done with black metal a long time ago, I think a few years back. And I did a list for old school death metal, and I figured it would be a cool idea to do one for brutal death metal. So if anybody else wants to hop on this tag or leave their comments, I'm always down to hear other people's lists. And 13's kind of a small number, so I wasn't able to fit all the classics, but I did my best, and I think it'll be cool if everyone has, a little bit of variation in their list. So without further ado, let's get this started. And also, they're not in any order. I just put them alphabetically, and I guess there's no rules, but for my list, I'm doing full lengths only and no slam, so brutal death metal exclusively. So starting this off is Broken Hope with their second album, Bowels of Repugnance. This came out in 1993. And this is some really early brutal death metal, and Broken Hope really paved the way for a lot of the other bands that are going to be on this list. Specifically in the vocal department, this was very, very influential. Joe Ficek delivers just some of the most lowest and wettest sounding gutturals on any death metal record, period. I mean, that is really the highlight of this album. But also there's some really cool guitar riffs, and it definitely is still rooted in old school death metal, but this was kind of at the point where brutal death metal was really starting to become its separate genre. And this album really is where, to me, that crossroads kind of start to split. And yeah, it's just a really killer release, really gory lyrics too. I know Jeremy Wagner, he's a very good writer lyrically, and just he is away with language. She came out in chunks, Hobo Stew, Preacher of Sodomy. They all have some really dark and disturbing lyrics. But overall, this is just a really great record. Favorite part would be the vocals, just some really groovy, very heavy riffs. So coming in at number 1, Broken Hope, Bowels of Repugnance from 1993. And number 2, Decrepit Birth and Time Begins. This came out in 2003. And this is just one of my favorite death metal records from California. I love everything about this album. Tim Young brings definitely in my top 3 favorite drum performances just on any album ever. Decrepit Birth combines elements of technical death metal and brutal death metal to create a very, very intense and just whirlwind style of sound. And this album is definitely the most brutal death metal influenced. They later go on to explore more of the tech death side of the music, but I just love how this album blends like both styles of brutality and technicality together. It is very fast, and this is just a record that sounds super intense no matter what's going on in the music. If it's a little bit of a more slow part, which is not that often because this thing is flying really fast pretty much the whole way through, but every hit that Tim Young plays on the drums, like, it just sounds so heavy. Love the bass drum triggering. Yeah, this album sounds really great. Just really technical guitar work, and Matt Sotelo, he had a very interesting way, I think, of phrasing riffs, because it's very chaotic, but at the same time, it's not super difficult to follow along. It will definitely take a couple listens, but I'd say this is, for how heavy I think this is, I would consider this to be a fairly accessible, like, high-speed brutal death metal record. But yeah, this is just an absolute killer of an album. So many great tracks on here. My favorite is Condemned to Nothingness, also Of Genocide. It's like this interlude slow track, kind of reminds me of Morbid Angel. Yeah, just some really, really great stuff on here. Bass by Derek Boyer, who never fails to disappoint. So yeah, number 2, Decrepit Birth and Time Begins. Coming in at number 3 is Deaden with Hymns of the Sick. This came out in 97, I believe. And Deaden was a band that my favorite part about it is just how nasty this record sounds, both in the imagery and the lyrics and the riffs. It just sounds downright disgusting. Um, Pretty much sounds exactly like how that album cover looks. But yeah, Deaden, they played a pretty fairly simple and straightforward style of brutal death metal. It was nothing really on the fringe realms of experimental or anything like that. But overall, it's just a really classic of an album. It kind of, to me, it captures that Midwest style of brutal death metal, just very nasty and really gross sounding, but also with cohesive songwriting that's really well done, in my opinion. Vaughn does a really good job on guitar and vocals, and I do like the drum performance on here by Ethan. Like I said, not the fastest thing in the world, but it definitely has some tasteful fills, cool blast beats, and just some really groovy drum work, which makes this a very, very enjoyable listen. Not too much to it, other than it's just really great brutal death metal. So, number 3, Deaden, Hymns of the Sick. Coming in at number 4 is Disgorge with their third album, or second album, I guess, depending on what you consider cranial impalement. Their third album, Consume the Forsaken. And yeah, this, if there was one classics of all the classics, this might be it. Disgorge plays a very, very fast and just absolutely maze-like style of brutal death metal, and especially on this album is goddamn near impossible to keep up with trying to listen to it. I think that's like a really big appeal about this band, especially with Sheila Gutted, and this album is when you first listen to them and when you try to digest them, at first it is just such a challenge to make sense of all the madness that is going on with these guitar riffs and the drums. Because thinking back to the first time I listened to this album, or even a band like Disgorge in general, I just couldn't comprehend how you go about listening to that kind of music. And I think it was something that really interested me. And this became like an album I was committed to getting all the riffs to memory, which was a challenge. And not to say I can play the whole thing in my head, but at some point you start to internalize these riffs. Then it's really fun listening to this, because Diego Sanchez's riffing style is unlike anything I've heard. I mean, plenty of bands go for that maze-like, super complex riffs, but Diego's riffing is just so absolutely unpredictable at first, and I love everything about it. I also love Ricky Myers on the drums. He plays some really, really good blast beats. This album to me is like my study in blast beats, because, you know, it's pretty much just a variation on the blast throughout the whole album, but he finds ways to spice it up and add really cool accents, or do something with his other hand that embellishes the eighth notes on the snare. And then also AJ Magana and Ben Marlin round out the lineup with great performances of their own. Yeah, this album is just absolutely crazy. Very, very extreme and really, really well done music. So, is that number 4? Yes. Disgorge, Consume the Forsaken. Coming in at number 5, another band from California, Deeds of Flesh, with their second album, Inbreeding the Anthropophagi. This came out in 1998 on Repulse Records. And this is another album that is just really, really technical and fairly difficult to follow. Yeah, this kind of takes everything that they did in Trading Pieces and amps up the speed, amps up the intensity. I would probably say Trading Pieces is maybe the more classic album, but I chose this one just because I prefer it a little bit more. And I think it's a little more intense and a little more extreme. Yeah, there's just some really great performances on here all around. Eric's highs are shrill as ever, and they sound great. Yeah, this album is just a real whirlwind of a record. I'd say it's probably the most technical record of the time period. Yeah, this thing's just really crazy. Definitely check it out. Deeds of Flesh, second album with Inbreeding the Anthropophagi. I talked about the first three Deeds releases in another video, so I feel like I've already kind of reviewed this one, but yeah, it's definitely a classic for sure. All right, I've lost track, but 6, I think, is Gorgasm with their first full-length, Bleeding Profusely. Really, really interesting and refreshing brutal death metal. Gorgasm is able to combine these really pretty classical melodies with high-speed blast beats, lots of tremolo picking, and really heavy and chugging breakdowns that contrast like high-speed riff picking that would happen before. So I feel like Gorgasm, they kind of established their sound very quickly on a record. You get the vibe, it's going to be tremolo here, melody here, breakdown here, but it's never something that gets old to me. This is my favorite brutal death metal record at the moment. And yeah, it's just a really interesting listen. I think the melodies really give this like just that extra edge for my enjoyment, because I'm a big fan of how Gorgasm is able to incorporate that into their sound. And I know it's not a real genre, but this genuinely is like melodic brutal death metal, because the melodies it's not like some other bands where they might just like trem pick a minor chord. These are like actual well done like classical melodies established in songs. The best example of them doing that is probably in Morbid Overgrowth, Postcoital Trinication, and Lesbian Stool Orgy, which is my favorite off the record. Just, really nasty lyrics, gross sounding death metal. Just great stuff. Like the drum performance on here too. Like a mix between the standard blast and the syncopated cepho blast. It just like alternates throughout the whole album, but it gives it a really nice driving feel. So yeah, I absolutely love this record. Gorgasm, Bleeding Profusely. Up next is Guttural Secrete from Las Vegas with their 2007 full-length titled Reek of Pubescent Despoilment. And I know I'm sounding redundant with all these records, but this is another one that is just absolutely heavy and pushes the limits of how extreme music can be. I mean, this is done in a way that is really familiar to the ear, but they also put their own twist on the style of brutal death metal mixed with that half-decent amount of slam. And it just sounds really unique to Guttural Secrete, because I feel like a band like Guttural Secrete is very interesting because on one hand, they're a group that really, you can hear their influences very strong, Cryptopsy, Malignancy, Devourment, but at the same time, it sounds so unique to them that when you put on this record, they just really have a sound of their own. And I think that's a pretty interesting thing to do, where they can balance like a familiar and almost sound that's been well established by the time this came out, but also put their own twist on it, to really put their own signature stamp on there. And a good example of what they can do to an already established sound is on the first song, Razorized Ball Gag. Probably the most popular, and I'd say it's one of the best on the records, but it just mixes like high-speed blast, really, really technical guitar work, but also with just really good slams and a mix of vocals. They're really good, and there's like a lot of different vocal styles on here. I think the guitarist Randy Thompson, he does like the pig squeals, and then the other guitarist Blue Jensen does just really, really wet vocals, and also super, super unique, like inhale highs and screams, which is probably another big standout on this album. Sounds a lot like Danny Nelson from Malignancy, but it's just when you hear that like inhale scream, to me that just is like what Guttural Secrete is all about. and that's my favorite part of this album. The vocals, the drums are also very good. Yeah, this album's pretty crazy. Best tracks: Razor Eyes Ball Gag, Coprophilic Asphyxia. There's this one part that it kind of be too hard to describe, but there's this slam in there. The way they set up, like the tempo change is just, oh, it's so heavy. Yeah, really, really crazy, over the top album, but it is really incredible. So, Guttural Secrete, Recapubescent Despoilment. Up next is Inveracity with their 2003 album Circle of Perversion. Inveracity plays a very straightforward style of brutal death metal, but they do it with a lot of taste and a lot of finesse. To me, the highlight of this record is how tight it is. Everything's really synced up, whether it be the blast beats, the bass, or the guitar chugs. It's just really well done. The best way I can describe this album is probably Suffocation's Pierced From Within meets Cannibal Corpse's Tomb of the Mutilated. There's a lot of like old school influence on here, but it's done through maybe the lens of, you know, the year it came out, like 2003. So it kind of balances like the new and the old, which makes this pretty familiar and easy to follow along. If you're new to the genre, I know this was one of the first albums that got me into brutal death metal, so I'd probably recommend this as a good starting point, especially if you like bands like Suffocation, Cannibal Corpse. And this record also has my favorite bass tone ever. It is just super clicky, and like the overall production has no mids, but it seems like the mids and like the highs on the bass are cranked all the way up, and the actual bass like knob is cranked all the way down. But I don't really know how they got it, but yeah, I absolutely love this bass tone. Really good stuff. Straightforward brutal death metal, but very tight performance and done with a lot of finesse. Great record. Inveracity, Circle of Perversion. Up next is Lust of Decay from North Carolina, I believe, with their first album, Infesting the Exhumed, from 2002, I believe, maybe 2003. But yeah, this band, it definitely reminds me a lot of Lividity, if you're familiar with that band. So I'd say they're pretty similar to that sound. It combines that pretty straightforward style of brutal death metal, but gives it really crazy low and high vocals and just really tasteful songwriting. The drums are really awesome on here. They're tuned pretty strange for a metal record, but I think it's very well done. Yeah, the toms are really high, and there's like a lot of cool, tasteful double stroke fills. Yeah, this is just another great record that combines pretty straightforward aspects of the genre, but they really managed to make it their own by catchy songwriting. And this is a band that really doesn't shy away from repetition. Songs like Festering Anal Vomit, Head in a Crockpot, they have like choruses that actually repeat a decent amount of times, which I think is very refreshing for a genre that is very focused on not a whole lot of repetition and really bringing an unfamiliar and maze-like style to songwriting, where Lust of Decay, they are able to do that, but they also know when to really just keep a riff going and get a catchy chorus in your head, which is really the standout to me on this album. Especially great drumming too. Yeah, first two tracks, Festering Anal Vomit, Head in a Crockpot, I would say listen to those two and decide if you like Lust of Decay, because to me it's like a little bit of a more technical Lividity, but still with catchy hooks and things that are easy and nice to remember. So Lust of Decay, Infesting the Exhumed, great record. Up next is Mortal Decay with their second album, Forensic. Yeah, this is just a real gem of the genre. Mortal Decay and this album is just really held in the highest regard by a lot of fans for good reason. This combines just super high-level musicianship with everybody, strings, bass, drums, and vocals, to create some really like advanced music outside of death metal in general. I feel like if someone is just into high level music, even if they don't like death metal, they can find something to enjoy with this album. It brings the speed, it brings eerie melodies, and it brings one of my favorite vocal performances ever by Johnny, who utilizes frog vocals, high vocals, whispers, and I would say it's like the most musical performance in the vocal department. Not that vocals aren't musical in general, but I feel like the way Johnny goes about writing his vocals is almost like the same way a guitarist would go about writing a riff. And there's just a ton of variety in all his vocal deliveries, which makes it super enjoyable. And like a lot of hardcore, grindcore influences. I think this really goes beyond what normal brutal death metal usually does. And I think that's why it makes it such a standout, because it's just, this album is really a piece of art, and really, really dark and messed up lyrics just add to the whole atmosphere and the appeal of Mortal Decay. Yeah, this album's been talked about enough, so Mortal Decay Forensic, great record. All right, the last three. So this will be number 11. Necrotic Disgorgement, Suffocated in Shrink Wrap. This is pretty much post-regurgitation after their band broke up, and it really continues the sound that they established with regurgitation, but just speeds it up a lot and adds way more blast beats, because this has all of the best parts about regurgitation, whether it's the really interesting intervals they use to tremolo pick their riffs, or the very strange but awesome James Murphy style like solos that they bring, but it's just done with pretty much nothing but blast beats and breakdowns. And I have to say, I do prefer it to Tales of Necrophilia. Yeah, this album's just nuts, and the song Suffocated in Shrink Wrap has a super dramatic slam in it. The first time I heard it, it gave me the feeling of when I first heard like the Legion of Inveracity slam for the first time. Like it sticks out so much, and they really do a good job at building up speed and then releasing it with slower riffs. But yeah, this is a great album. Cool solos, super guttural vocals, and just crazy blast beats the whole time. Necrotic Disgorgement, Suffocated in Shrink Wrap. All right, second to last, we have Viral Load with Practitioners of Perversion. Viral Load is kind of a band that plays a little bit more of a not-so-serious style of brutal death metal, but it doesn't mean that it has bad songwriting or anything like that. Actually, the opposite. It has really, really memorable and well-done songwriting. But the high vocals are kind of funny, and the drum machine that just like spazzes out like 350 BPM blast beats on a couple parts is just so goofy. And to me, that's my favorite part about Viral Load. It's not really a band that takes themselves so seriously, and they just kind of like to have fun with their music, but still make really, really incredible songs at the same time. First two songs are really catchy, Cockroach Cumrag and Raped with a Rake. This album is literally just filled with like alliterations from the title of the album and all the song titles. So it's like kind of goofy in that regard, but also it's just a really great listen, really fun listen. And yeah, Viral Load would not be the same like if they didn't have that like spaz drum machine on this record, and I have no problem with it, because that's my favorite part about this band, just how over the top ridiculous it can be in the best way possible. Yeah, so Viral Load, Practitioners of Perversion. And at number 13, Waco Jesus with The Destruction of Commercial Scum. Waco Jesus basically plays in what I believe to be the nastiest style of music imaginable. From the lyrics, the terrible, terrible imagery, and just, you know, really grindy vocals, really chromatic sounding riffs. It's just really like high energy brutal death metal. and I really like this record. It doesn't have a ton of super fast parts, but like the grindcore slidey power chord riffs are what gives it like a really high energy and fun appeal. I'd actually say it's probably one of the more accessible brutal death metal records if you can get over the imagery at first, because it's definitely shocking. But Waco Jesus is another band that most of their lyrics are kind of satire. It's not really anything too serious. It's just insanely over the top, ridiculous stuff. But yeah, just really like grimy riffs with a lot of chromaticism. And Dave Kibler from Lividity contributed high vocals on this record, and he has, especially on here, like the worst and best high vocals at the same time, because they're so like just shrill and it makes you want to cover your ears, but that's the biggest appeal to them. That's why I like them. It's like, oh, so bad, but at the same time, it's like the best high vocals ever. Yeah, just really like over the top lyrics, nasty riffs, but absolutely great brutal death metal. That, like I said, might be a good place to start if you can get over the themes and stuff like that. But anyway, that would be the last one with Waco Jesus, Destruction of Commercial Scum. That will round out the list at 13. So I hope you guys like this video, and if anyone wants to hop on the chain or leave comments, I would definitely like that. So thanks for watching.